We used to laugh that if we were both still single by 30, we'd just marry each other. Neither of us realized life was quietly listening. That was the promise Noah Carter and I made when we were 19, sitting on the hood of his beat-up pickup truck beneath a sky full of late summer stars outside our hometown in Oregon. We had just finished our first year of college, convinced we already understood everything about life, love, and the future. The idea of the two of us ever becoming anything more than best friends felt so ridiculous that we laughed until my stomach hurt. We even shook hands on it like it was the funniest contract in history. Every birthday after that, one of us would bring it up just to make the other groan. Only 5 years left, Noah would tease. Better start looking for a tux. I would roll my eyes and remind him that he snored loud enough to scare away every decent person in America. He always answered with the same crooked grin that somehow made every bad day a little easier to survive. Noah had been part of my life for so long that I couldn't remember where my memories ended and his began. We learned to ride bikes on the same cracked sidewalks, got grounded together after trying to build a treehouse that collapsed before sunset, survived awkward high school dances, impossible college exams, first apartments, first real jobs, and every heartbreak that came along the way. Whenever something wonderful happened, he was the first person I called. Whenever everything fell apart, he somehow showed up before I even asked. It became so normal that neither of us questioned it anymore. Friends did that, right? Best friends always chose each other first. At least, that's what I believed. Everyone else seemed to disagree. My mother used to smile every Thanksgiving and whisper that someday we would realize what was obvious to everyone else. Our friends never stopped making jokes whenever we arrived somewhere together. Restaurant servers assumed we wanted one check. Coworkers asked how long we had been dating before learning we weren't. Even strangers sometimes smiled at us with the quiet certainty reserved for couples who had been together forever. Noah and I always exchanged embarrassed looks before laughing it off. People have incredible imaginations, he would say. I always nodded because agreeing was easier than wondering why those assumptions never actually bothered me. Then life started moving faster than either of us expected. Careers became demanding. Weekends disappeared into meetings, deadlines, flights, and responsibilities. Noah eventually got engaged to a woman named Emily, someone kind enough that I genuinely wanted to be happy for them. When he asked me to stand beside him as his best man, I didn't hesitate for a second. I smiled for every engagement photo. I helped choose the venue. I listened to guest lists, flower arrangements, and playlists while convincing myself the strange ache in my chest was nothing more than nostalgia for simpler days. Maybe growing up always felt a little like losing something you could never explain. Maybe watching your best friend build a future without you was supposed to hurt just a little. I never admitted that thought out loud. I never even admitted it to myself. Looking back now, I think the truth had been quietly waiting for us long before either of us found the courage to see it. We thought our story began with a wedding invitation. We were wrong. It began with a joke neither of us was ever supposed to keep. The months leading up to Noah and Emily's wedding slipped by with surprising speed, measured less by the turning of calendar pages and more by the countless little moments that quietly reminded me how deeply our lives had always been intertwined. Saturday mornings still belonged to us whenever our schedules allowed. Noah would arrive at my apartment carrying 2 oversized coffees and a paper bag filled with fresh bagels from the neighborhood bakery we had visited since college. He never had to knock. He knew I always forgot to lock the door whenever I expected him. We would spend hours assembling bookshelves I had ordered online, watching football games neither of us cared enough to argue about, or driving aimlessly through the countryside with old playlists filling the truck just like they had years before. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything somehow had. Emily noticed it too, although never with jealousy. One afternoon while the three of us sampled wedding cakes at a small family-owned bakery, she smiled as Noah disappeared outside to answer a phone call. She stirred her coffee slowly before looking at me with an expression I could not quite understand. "You know," she said softly, "I have never had to wonder who Noah's favorite person is." I laughed because that seemed like the safest response. "You are marrying him," I reminded her. "I think you are winning." She smiled again, but this time there was something thoughtful behind her eyes. "That is not what I meant." Before I could ask what she was trying to say, Noah returned carrying the same easy smile he always wore around me, and whatever invisible conversation had almost begun quietly disappeared. I told myself I had imagined the entire exchange. After all, everyone interpreted close friendships differently. Noah had always been protective of the people he loved. That was simply who he was. When my car broke down during one of the coldest weekends of the year, he drove nearly 2 hours through freezing rain just to bring me home. When I caught the flu and could barely leave my bed, groceries somehow appeared outside my apartment door along with handwritten instructions reminding me to drink enough water and finish my medicine. He never asked for appreciation because helping me felt as natural to him as breathing. I returned those favors whenever I could, convincing myself that balance explained everything. Friends took care of each other. Best friends certainly did. Yet there were moments that refused to fit inside that simple explanation. During Noah's bachelor party, our friends spent the evening sharing embarrassing stories from college. At one point, someone joked that Noah looked happier standing next to me in old photographs than he ever had in any dating profile. The table erupted with laughter. Noah laughed too, shaking his head as he tossed a napkin across the table. "You people really need new material," he said. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he reached over and straightened the crooked collar of my shirt before returning to his drink without realizing what he had done. The conversation continued as though nothing unusual had happened. I was the only one who suddenly could not hear a single word. It was such a small gesture, something he had probably done hundreds of times without thinking, but for reasons I could not explain, it stayed with me long after everyone went home. A week later, while finalizing seating arrangements for the wedding reception, Noah looked across the dining room table covered with guest lists and handwritten notes. "I honestly cannot imagine one major moment in my life where you were not standing beside me," he said with an easy smile. I smiled back because it was expected. What I did not realize was that somewhere beneath those ordinary words, something quiet had already begun to shift, and neither of us was prepared for where that change would lead. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a sky so perfectly blue that it almost felt unfair. The historic vineyard outside Portland looked exactly like the photographs in the brochure Emily had proudly shown us months earlier. White chairs stretched across the green lawn, fresh flowers lined the aisle, and soft music floated through the warm summer air as guests slowly filled the venue with easy conversations and cheerful laughter. Everything appeared flawless, exactly the kind of day people imagined when they dreamed about beginning the rest of their lives. Noah stood in the groom's suite adjusting the sleeves of his charcoal suit, while I fixed my tie in the mirror beside him. We had spent years joking about this moment, although in every version of those old conversations, he had never been standing there waiting to marry someone else. "Do I look nervous?" he asked with a quiet laugh that sounded less convincing than usual. "You look like every groom in America," I answered. "You have checked your watch 6 times in the last 10 minutes. He smiled, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. I guess that is normal. I wanted to believe him. Instead, I noticed how often his attention drifted toward the window, as though he were waiting for something he could not name. The wedding coordinator entered, carrying a clipboard, and offered everyone a reassuring smile before reviewing the schedule one last time. Bridesmaids had arrived. Guests were seated. The ceremony would begin in less than 20 minutes. Everything remained perfectly on time, until it was not. At first, nobody seemed concerned. Emily was taking a little longer to finish getting ready. Someone joked that every bride deserved the right to be fashionably late. The musicians quietly repeated another song, while conversations continued beneath the shaded trees. 10 minutes became 20, then 30. The relaxed smiles slowly faded from the faces around us. Noah's mother stepped outside to answer a phone call, returning with an expression that immediately tightened every muscle in my chest. She whispered something to the wedding planner before quickly disappearing toward the bridal suite. Noah looked at me. "Something feels wrong." Before I could answer, Emily's maid of honor entered the room holding a neatly folded envelope with trembling hands. She did not speak right away. She simply walked toward Noah and placed the letter in front of him. The room fell completely silent. Noah stared at the envelope as though opening it might somehow change whatever truth waited inside. Finally, he unfolded the paper and began reading. His expression did not collapse or explode into heartbreak. Instead, it became strangely still, almost peaceful, as though one impossible question had quietly found its answer. After several long moments, he lowered the letter and released a slow breath. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to say. Eventually, he handed the page to me without a word. Emily had written with remarkable honesty. She apologized for the pain her decision would cause, but she could not promise forever while carrying a growing certainty that Noah's heart had never completely belonged to her. She wrote that she had spent months watching him with the person he trusted most, laughed with most freely, searched for first in every crowded room, and called before anyone else whenever life became beautiful or difficult. She insisted there had never been betrayal, only a truth neither of us seemed willing to recognize. Her final sentence refused to leave my mind. You both keep insisting you are only best friends, but the way you choose each other has never looked like friendship to me. I slowly lowered the letter, unable to meet Noah's eyes, because for the first time in my life, I was no longer certain that Emily had been wrong. The ceremony never happened. Within an hour, the elegant vineyard that had been filled with laughter transformed into a place of quiet conversations and careful goodbyes. Guests drifted toward the parking lot carrying untouched wedding favors, uncertain smiles, and a story they would probably retell for years. Noah thanked every relative who stopped to offer sympathy with a calmness that almost seemed impossible. He never criticized Emily. He never raised his voice. He simply told everyone that sometimes the hardest decisions were also the kindest ones. Watching him stand there with so much grace made my chest ache even more. When the last car disappeared down the long gravel driveway, the silence settled over the empty venue like the end of a play after the audience had gone home. I found Noah sitting alone beside the small lake behind the vineyard, still wearing the suit that had been chosen for a marriage that no longer existed. His tie had been loosened, and his polished shoes rested beside the wooden dock while his feet skimmed the cool water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We had never needed words, just to share space. Finally, I sat beside him and handed him a bottle of sparkling water from the reception cooler. He accepted it with a tired smile. Remember when we skipped graduation rehearsal because we thought fishing sounded more important? He asked unexpectedly. I laughed despite everything. We did not even catch a single fish. No, he agreed. But we convinced ourselves it was still a successful day. We continued remembering old stories as the afternoon slowly faded into evening. The conversation wandered through forgotten road trips, terrible apartments, birthdays, broken furniture we had assembled backwards, and every ridiculous adventure that somehow became one of our favorite memories. For the first time since reading Emily's letter, Noah genuinely looked like himself again. As the sun slipped lower across the water, he leaned back on his hands and quietly exhaled. Do you think she was right? The question arrived so gently that I almost missed it. About what? I asked, even though I already knew. He looked across the lake instead of at me. About us. My heartbeat suddenly felt much louder than the evening breeze moving through the trees. I searched for an easy answer, something comforting that would restore the world we understood yesterday morning. Instead, I found only uncertainty. I do not know, I admitted honestly. Noah nodded once, almost relieved that I had not rushed to dismiss the idea. Neither do I. Another long silence settled between us, but it no longer felt comfortable. It felt fragile, as though one careless sentence might permanently change something we had spent years building together. The reception building behind us had not yet been cleaned, and someone inside accidentally started the playlist that had been prepared for the first dance. Soft music drifted across the water. Noah smiled faintly before shaking his head. Life has a strange sense of humor. It always has, I replied. He stood and brushed the dust from his suit jacket before offering me his hand to help me up. It was an ordinary gesture, one he had made countless times over the years. I reached for him without thinking. Our hands met, and for reasons I could not explain, neither of us let go right away. We simply stood there, looking at each other as the music echoed faintly across the empty vineyard. There was no dramatic confession, no impossible moment that suddenly rewrote our lives. There was only a quiet awareness that something invisible had shifted between us, something neither friendship nor habit could completely explain anymore. Then Noah gave my hand the smallest squeeze before slowly letting go, and somehow that simple touch stayed with me far longer than every word we had spoken that day. The drive back to the city felt longer than it had that morning. Noah insisted on driving, even though neither of us had much to say anymore. The familiar highways stretched ahead beneath, a sky turning shades of orange and deep blue, while the radio played softly in the background, filling the silence without asking anything from us. Normally, we would have debated baseball scores, argued over which roadside diners served the best pie, or laughed about some ridiculous memory from college. That evening, every conversation seemed to stop just before becoming important. Emily's letter sat folded inside the glove compartment, only a few inches away from us, yet it felt heavier than anything either of us had ever carried. Halfway home, Noah pulled into a quiet overlook above the Columbia River, a place we had visited dozens of times over the years whenever life became too confusing to solve indoors. The parking lot was nearly empty. A cool breeze rolled across the water as the last light settled over the cliffs. Noah climbed out without saying a word, resting his arms against the wooden railing while watching the river move steadily toward the horizon. I joined him a moment later. "Funny," he finally said with a small smile. "This place never changes." I looked across the water. "Maybe that is why we always come back." He nodded slowly. "Maybe." We stood there for several minutes, listening to nothing except the wind and distant birds settling for the evening. Then Noah laughed quietly to himself. "Do you remember sophomore year when Kelly asked if we were secretly dating?" I smiled despite myself. "You told her we argued too much to survive a relationship. You answered that nobody would willingly date someone who stole French fries off other people's plates." I looked at him. "You still do that?" "I absolutely do." We both laughed, and for the first time since the wedding had fallen apart, the sound felt genuine instead of forced. It reminded me of every version of us that had existed before the questions became so complicated. Noah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver keychain shaped like a compass. I recognized it immediately. We had bought matching ones during a road trip after graduation, promising that no matter where our careers took us, we would always find our way back home. Mine still hung from my apartment keys. "I almost threw this away once," Noah admitted quietly. I looked at him with surprise. "When, a few months ago, I thought maybe it was time to stop holding on to old things." He turned the keychain over in his hand before smiling faintly. I could not do it. Without thinking, I reached over and gently closed his fingers around it. Some things are worth keeping. Our eyes met again, and this time neither of us looked away immediately. There was no rush, no panic, only a strange stillness that seemed to separate us from the rest of the world. I noticed details I had somehow ignored for years: the tiny scar near his eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident, the tired kindness in his eyes, the familiar expression that had always made me feel safe no matter what life was doing around us. Before I realized what I was doing, I smiled. Noah smiled back with the same warmth that had carried us through half our lives. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us had never felt smaller, yet it had never carried so many unanswered questions. Then Noah quietly whispered, almost as though he was afraid the evening itself might overhear him, "I do not want today to be the reason we lose what we have." I answered with complete honesty because it was the only truth I knew. "Neither do I." As we walked back toward the truck, our shoulders brushed for only a second, but this time neither of us pretended not to notice. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that looked almost identical to our old lives, at least from the outside. Noah returned to work at the architecture firm where he had spent nearly 8 years designing homes for other people while quietly trying to rebuild his own future. I buried myself in long hours at the marketing agency, accepting every project that crossed my desk simply because staying busy felt easier than sitting alone with my thoughts. We still texted each morning. We still shared articles, bad jokes, restaurant recommendations, and photographs of neighborhood dogs that somehow reminded us of each other. Anyone reading our conversations would have assumed nothing had changed. They would have been completely wrong. Every ordinary moment suddenly carried an invisible weight. When Noah sent me a picture of a coffee shop we had always planned to visit, I stared at my phone far longer than necessary before replying. When my favorite baseball team won an extra innings game, he remained the first person I wanted to celebrate with, yet I hesitated before pressing the call button. Something simple had become strangely complicated. We were still choosing each other first, but now we were painfully aware that we were making that choice. One Friday evening, Noah invited me over for dinner, insisting he had finally learned how to cook something besides pasta. His apartment looked exactly the same except for one noticeable difference. Every framed engagement photograph had quietly disappeared. The empty spaces on the walls caught my attention immediately, but I pretended not to notice. Instead, we spent the evening laughing over a homemade pizza that somehow managed to be burned on one side and undercooked on the other. "I think frozen pizza officially wins," I said after one bite. Noah laughed harder than I had heard him laugh in weeks. I was hoping for encouragement. "I am encouraging you to order takeout." The familiar rhythm returned so naturally that for a little while I almost believed we had found our way back. After dinner, we carried our drinks onto the apartment balcony overlooking the city lights. The warm summer air drifted between us, while distant traffic hummed below. Noah rested against the railing with the same thoughtful expression I had begun noticing more often. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "You always can." He nodded once before choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever wondered why neither of us ever stayed in a relationship very long?" I tried to answer with another joke, but the words never came. Instead, I realized I had wondered exactly that many times without allowing myself to finish the thought. Every relationship I had ever started eventually faded because something always felt incomplete. I had blamed timing, work, distance, or simple bad luck. Now those explanations suddenly felt less convincing. "Maybe we just had impossible standards," I offered weakly. Noah smiled, although sadness lingered behind it. "Or maybe we were comparing everyone else to something we already had." His words settled gently into the silence between us. Neither dramatic nor demanding, they simply existed, impossible to ignore. I looked across the skyline, searching for an answer somewhere among the glowing office buildings and apartment windows. Instead, I found only memories. Every birthday Noah had never missed. Every difficult phone call answered on the first ring. Every quiet drive after a disappointing day. Every holiday spent together because it simply felt right. The realization arrived so slowly that it almost frightened me. Perhaps love did not always begin with fireworks or perfect first dates. Perhaps sometimes it grew so quietly over years of loyalty, laughter, forgiveness, and unwavering presence that you only recognized it after it had already become part of who you were. I finally looked back at Noah. He was already watching me, waiting patiently, not for an answer he expected, but for the truth we had both spent years walking around without ever daring to face. Neither of us answered that question on the balcony. We did not have to. Sometimes silence carries more truth than words ever could. I went home that night with the city lights still reflecting in my mind, replaying every conversation we had shared over the past decade, as though someone had quietly rewritten the meaning behind each memory. Sleep never really came. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered Emily's letter, Noah's question, and the realization that perhaps the life I thought I understood had been telling me a different story all along. The following weeks became the strangest season of my life because nothing dramatic happened, yet everything felt different. Noah and I still saw each other, but we had both become unusually careful. We laughed a little less loudly. We thought a little longer before reaching for a familiar hug. We hesitated before sending messages that once would have been effortless. It was as though we were both trying to protect something fragile without fully understanding what it was. One Saturday morning we met at our favorite farmer's market, a tradition we had kept almost every month for years. Vendors greeted us by name. The woman who sold homemade jam smiled as she packed 2 jars into a paper bag. "It is nice to see you boys together again," she said warmly. "You always seem happiest when you are with each other." Noah smiled politely while I looked down at the basket in my hands. Neither of us corrected her. We simply thanked her and continued walking. That tiny moment stayed with me longer than it should have. It seemed the entire world had always seen something that we had stubbornly refused to acknowledge. As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, our schedules became busier, giving us convenient excuses to spend less time together. Days turned into a week without dinner. Then another week without our usual Sunday morning coffee. We still exchanged messages, but conversations that once lasted hours slowly became shorter. Good morning became have a great meeting. Funny stories became simple thumbs-up reactions. Every unfinished conversation left behind a quiet disappointment neither of us admitted. One evening my sister called after noticing I sounded distracted. She listened patiently while I carefully avoided mentioning the real reason behind my restlessness. Finally, she sighed softly. "You know, Ethan, there is a difference between protecting a friendship and hiding from your feelings." Her words caught me completely off guard. What feelings? I asked too quickly. She laughed gently. The ones everyone else figured out years ago. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my apartment watching rain gather against the windows. I realized I could still picture every important moment of my life, and Noah appeared in every single one. Not because circumstances forced him there, but because we had always chosen each other. Somewhere across the city, he was probably sitting alone asking himself the same impossible questions. I reached for my phone more than once that night, typing messages before deleting them again. I wanted to tell him that I missed him, but missing your best friend was supposed to be normal. I wanted to ask if he was all right, but I had asked that question thousands of times before. None of those words seemed honest enough anymore. Then, just before midnight, my phone lit up with a message from Noah. It contained only one sentence. I think staying away from you hurts more than any answer ever could. I stared at the screen as my heart quietly admitted a truth my mind could no longer deny. For several minutes, I simply stared at Noah's message without replying. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I finally understood that every honest answer would change our lives forever. I picked up my keys almost without thinking and drove across the city through streets still shining from the evening rain. The traffic lights reflected across the wet pavement, while my mind replayed every year we had spent pretending that what connected us could be explained by friendship alone. By the time I reached Noah's apartment building, I had no carefully rehearsed speech, no perfect confession, only a quiet certainty that running away from the truth had already cost us enough time. Noah opened the door almost immediately, as though he had been standing there waiting. He looked surprised for only a second before stepping aside to let me in. The apartment was silent except for the steady sound of rain tapping against the windows. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. It had become the place where our most important conversations always began. Finally, Noah smiled with that familiar warmth I had missed every single day we had spent trying to protect ourselves from feelings neither of us fully understood. You came, he said softly. I nodded. I could not stay away. He looked down for a moment before quietly admitting, I hoped you would. We sat across from each other in the living room where we had watched countless football games, celebrated birthdays, planned vacations, and laughed about futures we believed would never surprise us. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I felt as though I were seeing the room for the first time. Noah leaned forward, resting his hands together. I have spent weeks asking myself whether I was confusing comfort with love, he admitted. Then I realized something. I waited. Comfort fades when people leave. What I feel only became stronger the farther away you were. His words settled gently into the room. There was no pressure behind them, only honesty. I smiled because I had discovered the very same truth. I kept telling myself I was afraid of losing my best friend. I confessed. Then I realized I was already losing you by pretending nothing had changed. Noah looked at me with quiet relief, as though we had both finally reached the same destination after taking different roads. Do you regret any of this? He asked. I thought about the canceled wedding, the sleepless nights, the confusion, and every difficult conversation that had brought us here. Then I slowly shook my head. I only regret how long it took us to understand what everyone else seemed to notice. We both laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. It felt familiar again, effortless, like coming home after a very long trip. Noah stood and walked toward the bookshelf where an old framed photograph rested beside several travel souvenirs. It showed two 19-year-old college students sitting on the hood of a weathered pickup truck beneath a summer sky, smiling as though life could never become complicated. He handed me the picture. We really believed we had everything figured out. I smiled at the younger versions of ourselves. Maybe we did. We just misunderstood the promise. Noah looked at me with steady eyes full of hope instead of uncertainty. I do not want fear making decisions for us anymore. I took a slow breath before answering with complete certainty. Neither do I. For the first time since everything had changed, there were no unanswered questions left between us. There was only trust, years of unwavering friendship, and the quiet beginning of something that had been patiently waiting for us all along. 2 years passed with a quiet kind of happiness that neither of us had ever expected to find. Nothing about our lives became perfect overnight, but everything became honest. Our friends stopped pretending to be surprised after the first few months. Most of them admitted they had been waiting for us to figure it out long before we ever did. My mother simply smiled the first time Noah reached for my hand during a family barbecue and whispered, "It is about time." Even Emily sent us a handwritten letter wishing us peace and thanking us for accepting that difficult day with kindness. She wrote that seeing us finally choose each other confirmed she had made the right decision for everyone involved. I folded her letter carefully and placed it beside the old photograph Noah had shown me months earlier, grateful that compassion had become part of all our stories instead of resentment. Life settled into ordinary routines that somehow felt extraordinary simply because we shared them honestly. Saturday mornings still meant coffee and fresh bagels. Sunday afternoons still belonged to long drives with no destination. We still argued about baseball, laughed over terrible cooking experiments, and teased each other about habits that would probably never change. The difference was that nothing needed to be hidden anymore. We no longer searched for excuses to explain why we always chose each other first. It was simply the truth. On the evening before my 30th birthday, Noah asked if I wanted to revisit the old overlook above the Columbia River. The moment he mentioned it, I knew exactly why. We arrived just before sunset carrying 2 cups of coffee and the same quiet excitement we had shared so many times over the years. The river flowed below exactly as it always had, steady and patient, reminding me that some things never stopped moving forward even when people believed they were standing still. We leaned against the familiar wooden railing while the sky slowly turned shades of gold and crimson. Noah reached into his jacket pocket and smiled. "Do you remember what we promised each other when we were 19? I laughed immediately because there was no possible way to forget. If we were both still single by 30, we would just get married. He nodded. Back then we thought it was the funniest joke in the world. Then he looked directly at me with the same steady kindness that had carried us through every season of our lives. I do not think it was a joke anymore, even before we understood why. My heart felt impossibly full as he gently placed our matching compass keychains in my hand. The silver had become slightly worn over the years, but they still fit together perfectly. We promised we would always find our way back, he said quietly. We did. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at the horizon where the last light of day met the river we had visited throughout every chapter of our lives. Then Noah smiled with the same crooked grin that had first made me laugh all those years ago. Ethan Brooks, we spent more than 10 years pretending destiny was a joke between best friends. I do not want to waste another day pretending. Will you keep choosing me for the rest of our lives? I laughed through grateful tears before answering the easiest question I had ever been asked. I have been choosing you for years. I just finally understand what that choice means. As we stood together watching the sun disappear beyond the hills, I realized love is not always something that arrives unexpectedly. Sometimes it quietly grows inside ordinary days, hidden beneath shared laughter, unwavering loyalty, countless small acts of kindness, and the comfort of always finding the same person waiting beside you. Looking back, the promise that once made us laugh had never been predicting our future. It had simply been revealing a truth our hearts already knew long before we were brave enough to believe it.